There's no single lure or presentation that is more synonymous with walleye fishing than the jig. In fact, I'd argue that jigs, tipped with live or soft plastics, are responsible for more walleyes hitting the net than any other lure. Part of the appeal of jigs is their versatility. Today, I want to teach you about 2 different jigging presentations and the tools that you'll need to succeed with each. Let's talk about jigging with live bait in the weeds and snap jigging with soft plastics. Whenever walleyes are in the weeds, which in a lot of lakes is really most of the year, jigs can be a great way to target them. Jigging through the weeds can be a snaggy and sometimes frustrating experience, and many anglers will turn to weedless jigs at times like these. Most of the time, however, I'll simply turn to a light jig, like 1/16 or maybe 1/8 of an ounce, typically with a long shank hook when I'm jigging in the weeds. A light jig will do 2 things for you. First, it will give your bait some glide as it falls through the water. Second, that light jig also won't go crashing to the bottom of the weeds. Instead, it will tend to sit right on top of them and pop off cleanly. Whenever I'm jigging in the weeds, I tend to use a longer rod, and this one is probably my favorite. It's a 7-foot 6-inch medium light power extra fast action St. Croix Legend Extreme. I pair this rod with a 2500 series reel and spool up with high visibility Seaguar Smackdown braided line. I've always been a high-vis line fan, especially for any jigging presentation, and becoming an avid line watcher helps me to see a lot of bites. Now on the business end of this presentation, I've got about a 16-inch leader of Seaguar Invisex fluorocarbon, and this does 2 things for me. First, it reduces my line visibility at the jig, and second, it gets me a little bit of abrasion resistance against those really stiff weed stalks and stems. Now early in the season, I'll just dress that jig with a minnow, and as we move into summer, I'll transition from minnows into leeches or maybe half a nightcrawler. When jigging through the weeds, use lots of short little hops and pops, and keep the bait moving rather than letting it rest on the weeds. This is really just a lot of wrist action, using the rod tip to move the bait. Snap jigging with soft plastics is at the opposite end of the jigging spectrum in many respects. When I snap jig, I'm typically working an edge, like a weed edge or a break line, and tend to fish parallel to the edge so I can keep my jig in the strike zone for a long time. Whenever I snap jig, I'll be using a heavier jig, typically 1/4 of an ounce, but I won't be afraid to go heavier when I'm using a larger soft plastic. Now when I'm snapping plastics, I'm also going to tend to use a shorter and stiffer rod. My favorite is probably this 6-foot 8-inch medium power extra fast action St. Croix Legend Tournament rod. Again, pair that rod with a 2500 series spinning reel and spool up with Seaguar Smackdown in that high-vis flash green color pattern. Now snap jigging is a much more active, aggressive jigging presentation. I'm still going to use a fluorocarbon leader, but now I'm going to use one that is a little stronger and stiffer. My favorite is probably this 20-pound test Seaguar Gold Label fluorocarbon. I typically snap jig with a 3 to 4-inch fluke or paddle tail soft plastic, but don't be afraid to go larger, especially later in the season. To work the jig, snap it sharply upward, say from 9 to 11 o'clock, and let it fall back to the bottom on a tight line. This is when you'll get bit. Then, pick up your slack and repeat the process all the way back to the boat. Snap jigging is a high-energy, aggressive way to fish and can generate some really exciting strikes. Jigging is a tremendously versatile way to put walleyes in the boat all season long. Add these 2 techniques to your jigging arsenal and watch your catch rate soar. I'm Jason Helfand, and I'll see you on the water.